Hi, and welcome to this week's, and there's Mrs. Bean, just right on time there. Welcome to this week's edition of the ongoing webinar question and answer, the question and answer webinars. Now, this week's topic was these nasty voices inside our heads that beat us to a pulp or nagging us and telling us all these bad things. And, as I mentioned in the broadcast this week, all of these voices and what's going on in our head has a great deal to do with our mental states, whether it's depression, anxiety, some kind of combination thereof. I'm sort of a different kettle of fish with bipolar. Thoughts could be way too far one way or way too far the other way, and I had to tame them all and kind of herd them back into a proper place in the middle somewhere. So, one way or another, as I said, these voices, this dialogue, this narrative we've got going on in our head is really just a reflection of our thoughts. Our thoughts are more or less a reflection of our mental states. So this is, when we want to tame these inner polar bears of ours, there's a number of things we have to work on, and they have to work together in concert, okay? This has always been the big part of the polar bears and the positive difference-making fundamentals and all of that. Too many approaches I saw would just try to focus on a single aspect. And, in all my experience and all my research and all the people I've talked to, that's not really enough. And what you will often see is perhaps short-term gains, and it looks okay, you feel you got it beat, and then something happens and you're right back down the sewer again. So, today we're talking about negative voices and what they mean, why they're there, and what to do about them. But, I always have to ask you to bear in mind, this is part of a bigger picture. There's, as I say again and again, and I say this in the blog, or try to remember to say this, there's no one magic bullet. There's no single one aspect. It has to be looked at a big picture and approached from many aspects and angles, okay? So, just to remind again a little bit where these voices come from, believe it or not, you don't put them there. They just show up. If you think about that, you'll find that's true. You're just sitting there minding your own business, and all of a sudden these naggy voices are on your case about something. So you don't put them there. They all burble up from deep brain regions. Let's look at our little chart here. It's impossible to get into this today, but thoughts, I love studying the whole business of thoughts. And a lot of these negative emotion-driven thoughts are, ding, 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 generated way, 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 way down here in our deep limbic region, which is kind of above the base, or right around the base of our skull and kind of behind our ears, more or less. And way more activity travels from here up to where, we are kind of up here. So this is what's going on. They come from very deep brain regions. And that's why they seem so hard to control, because they come from such deep brain regions, and those are, generally thought to be outside our conscious control. That's what we're kind of working on when we do all this stuff, learning how to take more conscious control over these things. And many of these negative thoughts, if you think about it, will be about self-appraisal. You know, what's going on with ourselves? You know, what do we look like? What do we, and I'll get to this in more detail in a minute. You know, a lot of them will be self-evaluation and comparing to others. So, you know, back to all my kind of wider picture, human behavior, evolutionary, biological basis for human behavior. You know, like it or not, whether, you know, we are a social species, and we are all deeply wired to compete and to compare ourselves to others. And you can, you know, look at that any way you want or try to argue against that, but I'm sorry, that's just the basic way people work. And many other social species, even dogs, have their own way of doing that, and they do it through scent and all kinds of things. But humans are the most sophisticated at it, and probably humans beat themselves up a lot more about it than other social species. But anyway, so a lot of these thoughts, if you kind of stop to examine them, and we're going to work on this whole examining business more when we do the mindfulness meditation broadcast and webinar. But a lot of these will have to do with how we stack up against the competition. You know, and again, whether you consciously think this way or not, or believe that or not, that is in fact what's going on. So the point of that is, this is very common. It's not just you. We virtually all do this with relatively rare exceptions. And the only thing that really varies is kind of the language, tone of voice of how we do this. Okay, now this is really important. I just want to touch on those two again. Social species, very competitive, always self-evaluating to see how we stack up with, you know, the world, the people around us. This is just what we do. This is what we're wired for. And I will come back to that. Actually, right now, that's next on my list. So, you know, I followed all this business for many, many years. You know, I've always struggled with a lot of these things. And like a lot of people, I've done, you know, read different self-help books and taken courses and seminars and stuff. This goes back years and years ago. And, you know, what you will find is a lot of advice about dealing with negative self-talk is to kind of, you know, say it's not true. Your voices, you know, these voices are lying to you. And they all kind of sort of come down to, you know, trying to suppress them. And, you know, and I just personally found this never worked. You know, like I said last week, you know, there's something going on, and I'll get to this going on part in a minute. You know, there's something deeper going on. And these voices, as I said, they come from, you know, these thoughts, these self-evaluating type thoughts come from very deep brain regions, very powerful, a lot of say in our thoughts and behavior. And, you know, when there's stuff going on down there and it has some real oomph, emotion, power to it, you know, a lot of these techniques we learn are just kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a boiler. We'll learn these techniques. We'll tell ourselves, you know, shut up voice, or that's not true, you know, or these positive pet talks. And, you know, they're only going to work for so long if we don't deal with what's going on underneath, okay? So the whole polar bears approach, quite different. I Well, it's the polar bears. I learned I had to tame the polar bears, whether they were manic, depressive, mixed episode, all these different things that were generated. And when I do this little fist thing, what I'm doing is referring to these deep brain, real powerful brain regions down here. That's where the work has to be done. So, what I discovered, and again, back to my analogy in the broadcast of this kind of board of directors, all these self-evaluating sort of voices are kind of supposed to be there. The self-critic is supposed to be there. And I found, and I'll go into details about this a bit later, and I've got some good questions to address. I found I had to listen to them and simply learn a better way of hearing what they're saying and dealing with that one way or the other, along with some other core things to work on. Okay, so that kind of brings us up to where we were last week. And everything else. Yeah, okay, here, this was kind of the next point. Now, I said in the broadcast, this all has to start with the power of compassion, forgiveness, and there's quite an element of acceptance as well. And I kind of know that, and it's just something I've learned through all my study and stuff, but I thought I'd better dig around and come up with some other backing information on that. And I found, that is absolutely true. One of the books that kind of inspired a lot of what I do about exactly 4 years ago, Stanford professor Kelly McGonigal and her book, The Willpower Instinct, she gets into this quite a bit in depth. And what research has found is that, like I said in the broadcast, a lot of this harsh inner critic and constantly harping on ourselves and beating up on ourselves is quite tied into motivation. It comes back to who we are as a species. We're very competitive, and our stress response system is very deeply connected to this. What's going on with other people? How are we stacking up? We better get it together. And a lot of this is our what sort of amounts to motivational drives. And so a lot of this beating up inner voice is telling us, is kind of our motivating factor for a lot of people. And this was very true for myself. If I didn't, constantly harp on myself, I wouldn't get things done. I wouldn't, strive to be better in all these things. But what research has found is that this harsh inner critic, this negative voice, actually makes people less productive, more likely to procrastinate, less self-accountability. Remember, this harsh inner critic is kind of all about, self-accountability, self-responsibility. And, what research has found is the worse the inner critic, the poorer sort of performance and results on self-accountability. And as I said in the broadcast, this is almost invariably linked to various states and types of depression and anxiety. So back to, emphasizing what I mentioned in the original broadcast, it's self-defeating. We're feel like we're pushing ourselves ahead, but we're not getting ahead really. And this is what feeds so badly into this cycle. We beat ourselves, do this more, do that more, don't do this, don't do that, go, go, go. And we don't really get to wherever it is we want to go, whatever that is. And this, like I say, the brain's always evaluating these things, whether you're aware of it or not, and it's going to go ding, 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 you're not getting anywhere. And this kicks in the more self-beating up cycle, okay? So, we like I said, we really have to start with self-forgiveness, compassion, and an element of acceptance, which I'll get to a little more towards the end. And that's what the blog is all about. That's what the polar bears is all about. We're not going to tame those polar bears if we don't learn to forgive ourselves more, have more compassion with ourselves, and learn a little more about self-acceptance, okay? Now, I know that's kind of a real big kettle of fish, but the whole blog is kind of based on there. If you poke around in there enough, your brain will start to soak it up. I've talked to people, regular readers of the blog, and they just wake up one day and it's better, because they just sort of absorb the message, and the message kind of takes root down there and becomes a bigger part of their inner mind workings, okay? So, I've got another note here. The more we learn compassion, forgiveness, the better we'll build self-accountability. The better we build self-accountability, the better we will get at achieving, all those little things that make up, what our wants and goals and things are. And the less negative self-image we'll have. A lot of these negative inner voices are about a negative self-image. And the more, and again, this is based on a lot of research, that the more we self-compassion, self-forgiveness, some self-acceptance, the better the self-accountability, which is kind of what we all really want, isn't it? And less negative self-image, okay? So, I have a question, yay. How do I learn more normal, positive, friendly self-talk? Okay, that's a great question. Let me see, I have some notes on that here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Okay, how are we doing for time here? Yay, not even 20 minutes yet. And we're on to our first question. Okay, let's repeat the question. How do I learn more normal, positive, friendly self-talk? There's kind of a number of different approaches to that. Again, there's not a one-size-fits-all magic bullet for these kind of things. You start with where I just meant with what I just mentioned, the more self-compassion and forgiveness and things, but that will help, but it's only that, even that is only going to go so far if we don't learn a different sort of inner language, inner narrative. Now, when I'm touching on this question, last in the broadcast, I said there were kind of two, I think, kind of distinct inner critics. One will be constant, always, and this is almost invariably a product of one's home and school environment. For others, it will only kick in when things go wrong, or some unusually high stress, something like that. So one is kind of constant. The other is what I call episodic. For someone for whom this has been constant for most of their life, this is more challenging. Also allows you to give yourself more self-forgiveness. You didn't put that voice there. This is a product of your upbringing and all kinds of things. And you're a kid. You didn't have control over that. And then it just becomes part of our zombie programs. All these all our sort of inner dialogues, whatever they're about, are the product of what I've referred to as zombie programs, the programming that just kind of runs most of our brains. So when we're changing these things, what we're doing is kind of changing some real fundamental programming and wiring in brain regions. And that takes time. And I have kind of several ways to do this. Now, in more detail, this is a lot of what I talk about in the mindfulness meditation CBT. So, I'll get to this in more detail on that. And I believe that is, today is self-dialogue, next week is music therapy, I think. 2 weeks will be, in 2 weeks will be about the mindfulness cognitive behavior therapy. So we'll get into that a little more detail, get into this in more detail then. But for now, I just want to touch on this whole kind of self-evaluation business. Because when we're going to train our brains to talk differently to ourselves, to present us with quote unquote normal, positive, friendly self-talk, I'm just a really firm believer. We have to understand where these voices are coming from and why they're there. They're all there for a reason. And again, trying to constantly get these to shut up, in the end, in the long run, I don't think will work. So my approach is, okay, understand this is kind of a deep brain automatic self-evaluation thing going on. And I believe, and this is a lot of work, but we'll get there. It's a lot of work in the end, it's a lot of work in the beginning, but once you start to learn this kind of new habit and understanding what it is you're working on and why, you might be surprised how quickly this new process, this new thinking process begins to just sort of automatically happen. I was surprised. It was just like one day I'm thinking about all this stuff in a totally different way. So, a lot of these inner voices, the inner critics, all these things are about self-evaluation, and it's going to be about body type. It's going to be about how we look. It's going to be about how we act, what we do, what results we're getting. It's everybody has different ways of how this works in their head, but it's going to be probably something about lazy, probably something about being ugly or ghastly looking or unattractive or something. I would put a high probability on calling ourselves a loser, things like that, stupid, incompetent, no talents, no skills. You guys have been there. And it's this can be, kind of a constant little ongoing background thing in our, we're trying to focus on something else, and this is kind of going on in the background. Or there's those times, when we're really feeling down and beat up and defeated, You know, these voices will just thrash the absolute bejeebers out of us. So either way, whether it's kind of a constant little background thing or those times where we really just thrash the hell out of ourselves, this is kind of what's going on. So, you know, and like I said, these absolutely contribute. Well, they're kind of caused and contribute to this whole depressive, anxious, anxiety state cycle process. So what I found I had to do was just start poking through these thoughts, you know, what these things were telling me one by one. And again, I'll get into the details and process of this in the talk and webinar on mindfulness CBT. But we kind of have to, you know, what I taught myself was a real basic little process for dealing with these things. And, you know, when we, and like I say, these thoughts, you know, they come from this team of rival in our heads. You know, if we can think of them kind of like a board of directors, and they all have to have their say. You know, what I found is if you actually listen to them, like take the opposite approach. Don't try to make them shut up, because they won't. I mean, you know, look at yourself. You know, you have something to say and nobody hears you. You get frustrated and you try even harder to make yourself heard. And that's what's going on with a lot of these voices with all their, you know, things to say. So, you know, if we just, you know, kind of sit down and listen to them, and I know this sounds really weird, and I'll get to this more in the webinar, the talk and webinar on mindfulness CBT, but it's all in the post. I talk about all this in the post. I outline it quite clearly. You know, so we set aside this time. You know, you can't do this at the office and hectic day-to-day life. It's really important to set aside, you know, whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes at a time, you know, where we block everything out and just, you know, kind of get ourselves into, okay, boys or girls, whatever they are, let's hear what you got to say. Bring it. And, you know, the first thing that pops in your head is, I don't know, you're lazy. So, you know, I would take this thought, you know, I'm lazy, and I'd look at it. It's either true, maybe true, or not true. And, you know, this is where we start to learn some kind of outside objective ways of evaluating yourself. And this is a whole skill building thing. You know, when we're talking about self-evaluation, this is a different way to deal with this, a new thought process for dealing with all this, you know, what I would actually like rather call self-evaluating thoughts. Okay, so you start with something like lazy, and it's true, maybe true, not true. Sometimes it helps to have, you know, to begin with, you know, kind of an objective somebody to help you with this, but you know, we don't always have that kind of benefit, so we kind of have to learn to do this ourselves. And, you know, I talk to people, and, you know, they're working all the time, and yet they think they're lazy. And so for some people, I think we can say this is not true. You know, if you sat yourself down and tried to look at yourself from outside your head, and I'm going to get to this more in a minute, in a lot of ways, we have to learn to get outside of our own heads and try to look at ourselves from an outside objective view. And, you know, I know a lot of you have a very powerful sense of imagination. This is how to make better use of that imagination. Imagine yourself looking down, look at what's going on in your life. And, you know, maybe this laziness accusation is simply not true. You actually work pretty hard. Okay, so we might say, okay, that's really not as true as this voice is telling me. Maybe it's true. And, you know, we can look at these things. Let's look at maybe it's not, or sorry, maybe it is true or it's true. You know, we look at ourselves and we spend a lot of time not doing anything. And so we go, okay, this is kind of true. And we'll do two things here. First, we'll replace the word lazy with something more, you know, just neutral, objective. Okay, I certainly don't seem to be getting a lot done. I certainly seem to be, you know, spending a lot of time vegging out in front of the TV or something like that. And, you know, and this is really what the polar bears is all about. You know, and again, the self-evaluation. So, you know, I talk to people, and this is, you know, what's going on. They, you know, for just use this one lazy example, and you know, they're beating themselves up about this, and then, you know, I look at their lives, and I say, okay, you've been battling depression for 15 or 20 years or something. You've been battling anxiety. There's all kinds of physiological things going on there. If you think back to the talk on depression, you know, there's some biological stuff going on, but that you know, right down to the cellular level, that's involved in energy, and this is going to produce symptoms like not being able to do much. Okay. So we look at ourselves and we go, okay, I've been battling this for a lot of years. This isn't about me. This is about deep body biology. You don't control that. Nobody controls that. There's ways to improve that. And that starts with our thoughts. That's why we're going to work on this, people. So, and this is right where we have absolute valid, not just blowing rainbow colored unicorn farts up your butt stuff. This is absolutely valid. You can look at yourself and go, okay, this is, and you can say, I said so, if that helps. Brad says so. This is deep biology stuff. I've been battling this for a long time, and there's a reason I can't do as much as I would like. Okay, so we take this negative beating ourselves up thing. Oh, you're freaking lazy. What a lazy slob you are, you terrible person. And we go, whoa, okay, I hear what you're saying, but look, this is what's going on. Okay, and you have to be quite firm with yourself. This is the lazy person, you know, making these, or sorry, the voice making these lazy person accusations. You know, they're not going to shut up easily. I'll tell you that right now. But we have to take better control and understanding of the situation here. Okay, so that comes down to, and I should have printed out a little flow chart on here. I'll put a lot of this stuff on the blog. So if you're not, you know, if you want some notes and things on this, don't worry about it. I'll put it up on the blog. Okay, so, you know, back to our example, we have this naggy voice telling us we're lazy and awful and all these things. And we sit down and we go, okay, I'm going to sort through this a little more logically and objectively. And, you know, we might find in a lot of cases it's not true. We actually worked our butt off over there. Sometimes it's maybe true. We kind of worked our butt off and then, you know, didn't do much for a while. Or there's times we really can't do much at all. And, you know, if you're listening here, dimes to donuts, you've been battling depression, anxiety, all these things for a long time. And there are biological reasons beyond your conscious control for not having the energy, the drive, the motivation, and things like that, okay? So, but this freaking voice isn't going to go away unless we do something. So, you know, we kind of come to this acceptance. Okay, I'm not lazy, but I'm not as productive as I would like to be, okay? Not productive as I would like it to be. We're going to just put it into neutral language, not this way, not that way. Just the fact of the matter is I'm not as productive as I would like to be. We're going to look and we'll see, well, okay, actually I kind of worked my butt off with this. You know, it was hard. Like, it was really hard to do, you know, take my dog for a walk or jeepers, even get up and take a shower or something is hard work for us sometimes. So, you know, if we look at ourselves honestly, we'll see some areas where, you know, absolutely, I worked my butt off there. Other times where it's kind of maybe, and other times where it's kind of absolutely true. We're sitting around doing nothing. So, you know, we accept there's reasons we don't have the energy and drive we would like. And, you know, what we're going to do, and so much of what I talk about in the blog comes down to this. We just work day by day, little bit, you know, managing our energy better. You know, this is where the whole multiple, you know, positive difference making fundamentals comes into play. And, you know, okay, we'll you know, we need more energy. You know, that comes from what we eat, in part, not all, but in part. So, okay, I'll you know, I talk to some people, I work with some people on this, cutting down on junk food and sugar and eating a more balanced kind of steady diet throughout the day made a huge difference. And, you know, so we're going to say, let's start with that step. Okay, we have to do something. This freaking voice, it's, you know, that's what it's doing. It just simply wants us to do something. So, you know, we take this step. I'm changing my diet. That's made some difference. And we have to learn to really strongly input it into our mind that, you know, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what's right to do. And this is getting results. Maybe not instant. You know, this comes back to, you know, kind of self-compassion and forgiveness. We're not going to get instant results, people. This is the day-by-day, step-by-step process. But if we learn in these little self-evaluations, these little mindfulness meditation CBT sessions, you know, here's the issue: laziness. It's not really laziness. It's you know, we're not as productive as we'd like to be or used to be or whatever the case. And this is what we're doing about it. Then, because we're not going to get to where we want to overnight, there's got to be a level of acceptance. Okay, this sucks. I'm not productive. I want to be able to do more. But this is just the reality of living with depression right now. You know, it's not going to be our reality tomorrow and in the future because we're working on this. And these are the steps I could do today. And this is what I've done today. And maybe even they're not all the steps we want, but this is the best I could do on this day. Okay? And this ties together listening to the voice, what it's saying, dealing with what it's saying, self-compassion, and some action. And where's my little... Here we go. Here's my little CBT chart. You know, and that's where we take the thoughts, you know, kind of see how they're making us feel. And my screen froze again. Oh, here we are. You know, these absolutely suck, and they affect our mental states, where it says feelings here. This is really about mental states and moods and things. So we take the thoughts, we hear them, and we put this into action. This helps our thoughts feel a little better. Okay, woo, I did something. Give yourself a high five or atta girl, atta boy. I'm serious, I did this every day. And this helps our mood a little bit. The mood helps us take action a little better. When our mood is not so negative, when our thoughts are not so negative, ding, 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 hello people, we will have more energy to be more productive. That's what all the research says. That's totally backed up by research. And we just slowly get things moving in the right direction. And, you know, we can take every one of these negative things these voices are telling us and approach them with the same basic steps. You know, we have to keep the simple basic steps. Here's the voice. What's it saying? Is it not true? Maybe true, or it is true. And we either do something, learn little daily steps to address that, or acceptance. Sometimes acceptance is necessary. Sometimes there's just some things we can't change right away. And we have to put that on a different plate and not on our daily plate. You know, this is a long-term project. For now, I have to accept that. And, you know, I went through some, you know, I've been working on this like this for 4 years. I went through some really miserable times, you know, being forced out of places of where I lived, forced to move, evicted, living in some shitty circumstances. And I had to have this conversation a lot. Okay, I don't like this. This is making me miserable. But for now, I have to accept this and focus my efforts somewhere else. Okay. So again, I'm going to get into that in more detail in the mindfulness, the session on mindfulness CBT, which is in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today, folks. Mark your calendar. And I'll put this in the blog as well. Okay. Now, the next thing about these freaking thoughts of ours is, you know, this is pretty classic psychology. And if you work with a lot of therapists or read a lot of advice on this, that this is very good, valid advice. And this is a lot of what I do. So, you know, you're, like I say, you're kind of going about your business and you have these thoughts and voices going on in your head. And, you know, now as we're starting to learn more about this, you know, we have these voices, all these negative self-critics, naggy, you know, just constantly going on in the background. And, you know, now we're learning to understand this a little better. We can go, hello, you know, we recognize these thoughts are there. You know, the truth is we're not always going to have the power to deal with them. We can't always be, you know, we're not going to have the energy to always deal with them, as I just outlined. You know, that'll get, you know, sorry, back to where we were talking about with the kind of dedicated mindfulness approach. You know, that might start out 10, 20 minutes, but you'll be surprised, you know, how more of a natural process that becomes. But we're not always going to be able to do that. And this negative train of thoughts and all this negative self-dialogue and inner critic and all that stuff will just pop up here and there because they're such a natural part of our programming. The next strategy is to change focus. Okay, put your focus somewhere else. Give your brain something else to do. And that is why, people, I created the brain training exercises and music therapy When I'm too exhausted to do anything else, when I can't take action to solve the issues my brain's beating myself up about, what you have to do, what I had to do, what I learned I had to do, and what you have to learn how to do is strategies for changing your focus and putting your mind on somewhere else. Often that's music therapy for me. Music therapy is next week's topic, people. 1 week away. Well, this Wednesday I'll put up the presentation on it. A week from today is the webinar. And I get into music. There's different ways of doing that. I'll talk about that next week. Sometimes it's kind of a passive process, but other times I'm poking around learning new music, different versions of favorite songs, all kinds of things. And that's where I put my focus. It's relatively enjoyable. You'll learn next week that music therapy isn't always about putting on shiny, happy music and that kind of thing. And it's a learning process. And while I mentioned learning process, one of our big strategies for dealing with all this stuff, where's my notes here? No, for Pete's sake. Sorry, folks. Here we go. Some general stuff I'm going to mention. A lot of defeating all these kinds of things and really getting to the core of this inner critic stuff is all about self-growth, a growth mindset. So growth mindset is all about learning. So when we're looking at music therapy, it's not just putting on old favorite tunes or putting on these sad tunes and getting ourselves into even worse mental states. It's about taking something we love, music, and learning it in a different way. And that's I'm going to get into enormous amounts of detail on that next week. So, a lot of this is about creating a learning growth mindset. So when we are having trouble with these inner critics and inner voices, if we put ourselves in a different focus, change our focus, and do something that's relatively easy for us. Now some people, they've been so affected by all these long-term mental health problems, they might be on disability or something and have all the too much time to themselves, and this is a big challenge in itself. So keeping ourselves occupied all day is a real big challenge, I found. And that's why, learning, giving ourselves tasks to do, and this is kind of a topic of a whole different kind of mindfulness training. But it boils down to putting our focus elsewhere. And, that can be music. I do my brain training games where I'm kind of focused on solving puzzles and training my mind to get better at finding solutions, solving puzzles, solving issues. As I do that, this whole negative inner voice thing kind of, that's going to pop up in your head. So I go, okay, I can kind of work on this a little bit while I'm doing these other things. And so there are a number of different ways, but we learn to change our focus a little bit. If you are working, if you're a working person and trying to deal with this, hats off to you. This is a whole different challenge than it is for some of us. It's hard when you're constantly around other people. This gets exponentially more difficult to work on. Oftentimes, as I talk to people about all these things, there's kind of two camps of us, those of us who've been impacted by this enough to be disabled, and kind of part of our problem is too much time, or we have working people, mothers, parents with a lot of other things on the ball. And there's been many times I feel I have to kind of create two different programs. The basics apply to everybody, but realistically, there's quite different approaches depending on whether you're kind of single and not working or not working so much, or maybe you're self-employed, an artist, something like that, and somebody else with family obligations and work obligations. The basic principles apply, but the strategies are a little bit different. Okay, so that's to answer the reader's the question, how do I learn a more normal, positive, friendly self-talk? There's this whole different self-evaluation process that I mentioned. Sometimes we just simply have to change focus. And the other basic approach, and the reality of this, is it's kind of like we're literally learning a new language. So that's kind of how we have to look at it. This language, this narrative for our head that goes on in our head, it is, as I said in the presentation, it's literally kind of killing you and really negatively impacting your whole state of mind and life. So it has to change. We made that very clear, but what we're really doing is learning a whole new different language, a whole different way of speaking. And, ties into the topic later this month. I think it's the last one of the month, what I call data input, and where we start to pay more attention to what we're absorbing. Like I mentioned, a lot of our inner dialogue will be a product of upbringing, our environment. This is kind of just what we've soaked up all our lives. And to retrain that, we have to put different stuff on our head. So, I do that through music therapy. I do that through the little self-training things I've talked about. Another important thing is we have to model others. If you don't know how to talk to yourself in a better way, look for somebody who you think is good at that and model them. Okay? And, that's a big part of what I try to do, is just be a better model to others, so you can kind of look to me as well, I guess. But that is a very powerful way to model others. If you don't know how to talk to yourself, and that is very normal, this isn't you, this is very, very many people, we just kind of literally don't know how to talk to ourselves about these things. Find somebody who you think is good to model. I have all kinds of ways to do this. I look at, there's athletes, there's musicians, there are, people who have to drive themselves. And I look at kind of how they do this. Coming back to this idea of a inner critic and self-motivation, and a lot of this is rooted in trying to drive ourselves forward. People do that all the time without beating themselves up, and so I look to learn ways of kind of motivated, successful people, and how do they talk to themselves. So real simple little example, okay, say I screw something up, and the old Brad would have said, "Oh, you effing idiot, what a freaking moron." I can take the exact same thing and just say, oh, come on, Brad, you can do better than this, and then work on that. That's what successful people do. Okay, so we can take this, whatever went wrong or whatever we feel about ourselves, look at it in a different way. The thing happened. We're not going to change that. All we can change is how we look at it, how we say it to ourselves in our head, and what to do about it. Here's Mrs. Boone. Okay, so instead of, Brad, you freaking moron, how many times are you going to make this stupid mistake? Instead go, okay, come on, Brad, you can do better than this. Dimes to donuts, I'm stressed and tired. Go, okay, I'm pretty stressed and tired. It's kind of natural to make mistakes under this condition. And what we can do about it, learn those steps and work on those little steps, and the whole conversation with ourselves can gradually begin to change. Okay. Now that's sorry, we get quite involved in these questions, don't we? But that's basically, she asked, how do I learn a more normal, positive, friendly self-talk? This is kind of what you all need to know. That the question is very, very broad reaching. This is almost everybody. If you're in some kind of long-term depressed state, short-term depressed state, this is what everybody needs to know. So, that question is kind of the whole idea of why we're here. So let me see, we're running out of time, 5 minutes. Couple notes here. Back to, the core of what's going on very quickly. A lot of this negative, how we talk to ourselves and the harshness of it is rooted in deep emotions. So, a big part of the whole Polar Bears program is learning to deal with these emotions better. Comes back to the CBT. We work on our thoughts. That helps us work on our emotions, understand our emotions, mental states, moods, that kind of thing. We take the action. The action creates better thoughts. The thoughts helps with these core emotions and things going on way down inside here. And that starts getting us going in the right direction. Where was my... so working on emotions is all kind of part of what we're working on here at its core. Now, I just had some things, a few general thoughts to leave you with, to try bear in mind. Again, when we're changing our inner dialogue, we're really learning a new language. How we talk to ourselves is the product of a long, long process. This is our kind of deep wiring, our programming. That takes time, okay? So back to self-compassion and forgiveness. If you have a bad day at this and get back into this, fall into the sinkhole, beating yourself up, you come out, and sometimes that's just going to happen. It just is. It still happens to me, believe me. But we come out the other side of it and we just go, okay, I had a bad moment, a bad time, a bad day, whatever. That's not the end of the world. And we remind ourselves that this takes time. It's a process. I have a whole long post on reality, and that kind of ties in here. That's there for a reason. It's not just blah, blah, weird science stuff. Mrs. Bean is knocking all my things on the floor here. I talk about reality because this reality, our negative self-image, our negative dialogue has kind of been our reality for a long time, for a lot of you. Not me, not so much, because I have constantly changing realities. But for a lot of you, this has been your reality for a long time. This comes back to your programming, you know, all this stuff in your head that creates you. So a lot of what you're doing is literally creating a new reality, new perceptions of yourself, the world, all kinds of things. And that too takes time. That's what the whole Polar Bears is about, changing your reality. You know, there's just, you know, I made the difference making fundamentals for a reason. You know, you can go there and there's always something to work on. You know, you look through those. Okay, I'm really beat up today. I can't do this. Maybe I'll do some of this or some of that. And the data input, which I'm going to, you know, what we feed our brains, because our brains are what we feed them in a very, very literal sense. And that's the topic. What did I say? 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks, 3 weeks from now. Okay. So that's coming up. A couple things to leave off before I sign off. If you are new to viewing this, you know, this is a whole different avenue of coming across Taming the Polar Bears on these YouTube channel and YouTube videos. So if you have stumbled across this and wonder what Taming the Polar Bears is, who I am, what I'm about, what all this polar bear stuff is, you can go to tamingthepolarbears.blogspot.ca. You go Google Taming the Polar Bears, you just enter Taming the Polar Bears, my blog will come up. If you have questions or want to know more, I'm looking at beginning private workshops. I do one-on-one therapy. You can write to tamingthepolarbears@gmail.com. A nice person will answer your email and try to work something out, okay? So there we are, 1 hour. We did it, 60 minutes. Next week is, this coming week is music therapy. You don't want to miss that. That is going to be it's going to blow your mind, okay? So signing off. Oops, now we're at 61 minutes. Okay, signing off. See you next week. Bye now.